The notice arrived early in the morning, during a stretch of time when most activity inside the building followed habit rather than urgency. I did not register the exact hour until much later, when I tried to reconstruct the sequence of events and realized that precision itself had become unreliable. What I remember clearly is the tone of the message. It was not urgent, not alarming, and not framed as an exception. It read as if the meeting it announced were routine, expected, already accounted for somewhere else. Mandatory attendance, secure briefing room, no materials required. There was no subject line, no reference number, and no indication of which office had issued it. That omission mattered. Inside the Pentagon, even the most tightly held briefings usually left some trace of origin, some bureaucratic fingerprint that could be followed backward if necessary. This one did not. It existed as an instruction without context. I considered the possibility that it had been sent in error. That happened occasionally, usually corrected within minutes by a follow-up message. None came. When I checked the internal calendar, the time block had already been inserted, cleanly and without notification, into a space that had been empty only moments before. Whatever system had placed it there had done so with confidence. At the security checkpoint, there was no hesitation. My name was already on a printed list. Others were there as well, though we did not speak. I recognized faces rather than names, people whose work touched adjacent corners of the system but rarely intersected directly. Policy, planning, coordination. No single chain of command connected all of us. That alone suggested the meeting had not originated from within any one directorate. We were escorted through corridors that were familiar enough to fade into the background, then into a room that felt deliberately chosen for its lack of distinction. It was smaller than most briefing spaces, with no central table and no visible markers to suggest hierarchy. The chairs were arranged so that no one sat directly behind or beside anyone else. The display screen at the front of the room was already on, but it showed nothing at all. No title, no classification banner, not even a default background. A security officer reviewed the standard restrictions. No devices, no notes, no recording. His delivery was practiced, but at the end he added a sentence that did not appear on the usual script. There would be no materials distributed after the briefing. No slides, no summaries, no follow-up packets. The statement landed quietly, but it altered the shape of the room. A briefing without residue was unusual. A briefing designed to leave nothing behind was something else. The presenter entered without introduction. He did not state his name, his rank, or his office. He carried nothing in his hands and did not approach the console that controlled the screen. He stood slightly off-center, as if the blank display were not meant to be part of the event at all. When he began speaking, he did so without framing remarks or acknowledgements. There were no visuals. There was no agenda. What followed was a sequence of statements delivered in a measured, even cadence. Each one stood alone. He did not reference prior points, and he did not signal transitions. The effect was disorienting at first, then deliberate. This was not a presentation meant to build an argument. It was a delivery of information that had already been decided. He spoke only in completed terms. Nothing was described as ongoing or hypothetical. Actions had been taken. Decisions had been made. Processes had been followed. When he referred to organizational activity, he did so obliquely, naming functions rather than offices, responsibilities rather than units. Locations were implied, never specified. Time was referenced only in relative language, enough to establish order but not chronology. As the briefing continued, it became clear that the phrasing itself had been engineered. Each sentence conveyed just enough detail to be understood in the moment, but not enough to be reliably repeated afterward. There were no phrases that could be lifted whole and reused without losing meaning. Nothing invited paraphrase. It was language designed to be heard once. The blank screen behind him never changed. At no point did he acknowledge it, and at no point did anyone else. The absence of a classification marker became increasingly noticeable. In other briefings, even when the subject matter was familiar, the level of sensitivity was always reinforced visually or verbally. Here, there was nothing. The room offered no cues about how the information should be treated, only the restrictions that had preceded it. The briefing ended abruptly. There was no summary, no invitation for questions, no indication of next steps. The presenter stopped speaking and stated that the briefing was complete. We were dismissed individually, not as a group, and escorted out through different exits. The separation felt intentional, though no one said as much. Later, when I attempted to locate a record of the meeting, I found only its outline. The room reservation existed. The time block was logged. The attendance list was intact. There was nothing else. No slides had been uploaded. No transcript had been generated. No after-action note had been filed under any review cycle I could access. It was as if the briefing had been constructed to exist only in that moment, bounded by the walls of the room and the memories of those present, leaving no artifact behind that could be revisited or examined. At the time, I did not know what to make of that. I only knew that whatever had been communicated was not meant to travel further than it already had. In the period that followed, nothing happened in a way that could be clearly identified as a consequence of the briefing. There were no directives issued, no programs announced, no sudden shifts in responsibility. If I had been asked to describe the immediate aftermath, I would have said, there was none. That, in retrospect, was the first indication that something had changed. The days returned to their usual rhythm. Meetings occurred when they were supposed to. Documents moved through review channels at familiar speeds. People spoke in the same careful language they always had. Yet beneath that surface, small inconsistencies began to accumulate, each one insignificant on its own, each one easy to dismiss if encountered in isolation. The first sign came through a routine task I had performed countless times before. A policy draft I had finalized earlier in the year was returned to my queue for what appeared to be a minor formatting correction. The request did not come from the office that normally handled such matters. It was routed through a generic internal address, one that did not correspond to any directorate or review board I recognized. The comment attached to the draft was brief and neutral, asking for clarification on a procedural threshold that had already been settled during earlier review. I made the requested adjustment and resubmitted the document. There was no acknowledgement. The draft did not reappear in circulation, nor did it advance to its next scheduled step. It simply vanished from my active list, as if it had completed a process I had not been permitted to see. Around the same time, I noticed changes to my calendar that I could not recall approving. Meetings were shifted by small increments, rarely more than 15 minutes, and occasionally reassigned to different rooms. These were not cancellations or additions, just subtle realignments. The notifications, when they appeared at all, were stripped of identifying details. The system recorded the changes as automated, even when they affected sessions that normally required manual approval. I checked with administrative support to confirm whether a new scheduling protocol had been implemented. I was told there had been no such update. The changes, I was assured, fell within acceptable system behavior. As the week progressed, similar reports surfaced in conversation, always indirectly. A colleague mentioned that a coordination call had ended without action items, something that rarely happened. Another noted that a draft assessment had returned from review with its approval. Timestamp altered, but without any accompanying explanation. No one framed these observations as concerns. They were shared casually, as curiosities, then dropped. What made the pattern difficult to articulate was its restraint. Nothing was altered enough to trigger alarms or formal complaints. The system still functioned. Decisions were still being made. But the logic that connected inputs to outcomes no longer followed the paths we were accustomed to tracing. At one point, I attempted to follow the revision history of a document that had been accessed multiple times without producing visible changes. The access logs showed activity clustered within a narrow window marked as system-level review. There were no user identifiers attached. That classification was typically reserved for maintenance processes or integrity checks. There were no maintenance windows scheduled during that period. I did not escalate the issue. Doing so would have required assigning intent where none could be proven. Instead, I began to observe more carefully, taking note of the ways routine processes drifted from their expected course. There was a growing sense that certain materials were being evaluated according to criteria that had not been communicated. Documents moved forward or stalled without reference to their stated purpose. Meetings concluded without conclusions. Decisions appeared in systems before the discussions that would normally precede them. What struck me most was the absence of commentary. In past situations involving heightened sensitivity, there were always informal signals, quiet reminders about discretion, subtle cues about what not to pursue. This time, there was nothing. The silence was complete. Eventually, I stopped trying to reconcile the inconsistencies and focused instead on how people responded to them. Questions went unasked. Clarifications were not requested. When anomalies appeared, they were acknowledged internally, then allowed to pass without remark. It was as if everyone had sensed the presence of a boundary without ever seeing where it had been drawn. The briefing itself was never mentioned. Not in meetings, not in correspondence, not in passing conversation. Yet its influence was detectable in the way ordinary procedures lost their predictability. The system had not been disrupted. It had been recalibrated, quietly and without announcement. By the end of that period, I understood that whatever had been conveyed in that room was not meant to produce immediate action. It had established a condition, one that altered how information moved and how decisions were validated. Those within the system adapted instinctively, adjusting their behavior without being told why. At the time, I did not consider this unusual. Institutions like ours were always evolving, always refining their processes. It was only later, when the pattern persisted beyond any reasonable adjustment period, that I began to suspect the recalibration had not been accidental. And still, no one spoke of it. It was only after that initial period of adjustment had passed that I began to recognize how carefully the recalibration had been constrained. Nothing expanded outward. No new offices appeared. No additional layers of oversight were announced. Whatever had changed was not growing. It was settling. The first place this became evident was in the way reviews concluded. Processes that had once ended with clear determinations now stopped short of resolution. Assessments were acknowledged, logged, and quietly set aside without being formally closed. In some cases, they remained accessible in the system, but their status fields no longer aligned with any category I recognized. They were not marked, complete, suspended, or deferred. They simply existed in a state that did not invite further action. I initially assumed this reflected a backlog or a temporary resource constraint. That explanation made sense on the surface. It fit the language we often used when priorities shifted faster than structures could accommodate. But as time passed, It became clear that the same materials were being accessed repeatedly, always briefly, always without modification. Someone was looking at them. No one was touching them. The access patterns were consistent. Short intervals, irregular spacing, no user attribution. The system recorded the activity as automated, but it did not correspond to any scheduled process. It was as if a mechanism had been introduced that did not announce itself, one that operated just beyond the edge of visibility. At one point, I tried to raise the issue obliquely during a routine coordination exchange. I framed it as a question about workflow efficiency, careful not to suggest irregularity. The response I received was polite, non-committal, and slightly delayed, as if it had been reviewed before being sent. I was told that some matters were now subject to additional internal validation and that existing processes would adapt accordingly. There was no elaboration. The phrase additional internal validation was not defined. After that exchange, the subtle signals began to shift. Certain inquiries I submitted were acknowledged more slowly. Others were answered with language that mirrored my own phrasing too closely, as if drawn from a prepared set of responses. The effect was not obstructive, but it was distancing. Communication still occurred. It simply no longer invited engagement. I became more attentive to how information moved around me. Documents no longer circulated widely before being finalized. Distribution lists grew shorter. In some cases, I would learn of a decision only after it had already been logged as settled. The rationale was rarely provided unless explicitly requested, and even then it arrived stripped of context. What struck me was how quickly this new equilibrium was accepted. There was no visible resistance, no whispered objections in hallways. People adjusted their expectations and moved on. Questions that would once have prompted discussion were allowed to pass unanswered. The system did not demand compliance. It rewarded quiet adaptation. At times, I found myself hesitating before initiating routine actions, unsure whether they would still be interpreted as appropriate. This hesitation was new. It did not arise from fear of reprisal, but from uncertainty about the rules themselves. The boundaries had shifted, and no one had redrawn the map. I noticed similar hesitation in others. Meetings grew shorter. Conversations became more circumspect. References to prior decisions were phrased carefully, often without naming them directly. It was not secrecy in the traditional sense. It was a shared awareness that some things were no longer meant to be revisited. There were moments when I considered documenting what I was observing, if only for my own clarity. Each time I stopped short. The act of writing would have required me to impose structure on something that resisted it. More importantly, I could not identify a proper repository for such a record. It would not have fit within any reporting framework I was authorized to use. The absence of a clear channel was itself instructive. As weeks passed, the briefing receded further into the background of daily operations. It was no longer something I thought about consciously. Its effects had been absorbed into routine behavior. Decisions were still made. Work still progressed. The institution functioned as it always had, at least in appearance. Yet beneath that continuity was a narrowing, not of authority, but of inquiry. Fewer questions travelled upward. Fewer explanations travelled downward. The space between action and understanding widened, just enough to discourage curiosity. At some point during that period, I realized that I could no longer say with confidence who was responsible for certain determinations. Responsibility had not been removed. It had been diffused. Decisions emerged without a clear origin, validated by their existence rather than by any visible endorsement. This was not a failure of process. It was the product of one. By then, It no longer mattered what had been said during the briefing. Its content had already done its work. It had introduced a condition that required no reinforcement. Those within the system adapted not because they were instructed to, but because the environment itself now favored a different mode of operation. I did not resist this change. Neither did anyone else I observed. Resistance would have required clarity, and clarity was precisely what had been withdrawn. The system had not become opaque. It had become selective, and those who continued to function within it learned, quickly and without instruction, which paths were still open and which were no longer worth pursuing. The longer the condition persisted, the more I began to notice its effect on memory itself. Not personal memory, but institutional memory, the way past decisions were recalled, referenced, and used to justify present action. Materials that had once served as points of reference slowly lost that function. They remained accessible, but they no longer anchored anything. When cited, they were acknowledged politely and then set aside, as if their relevance had expired without notice. This shift was most apparent during reviews that relied on precedent. In earlier years, precedent carried weight. A prior determination, once recorded, shaped the boundaries of what followed. Now precedent was treated as advisory at best. It informed discussion, but it did not constrain outcome. Decisions were framed as context-specific, insulated from comparison, validated by circumstance rather than lineage. At first, I attributed this to the natural evolution of policy. Environments change, frameworks adapt, but the speed and consistency of the shift suggested something more deliberate. It was not that precedent had been overturned. It had simply been rendered optional. I saw this most clearly when an issue resurfaced that I had worked on extensively in the past. The parameters were nearly identical. The risks, the constraints, even the language used to describe them were familiar. I expected the earlier conclusion to serve as a starting point, if not a guide. Instead, it was acknowledged briefly and then bypassed. The discussion moved forward as if the prior work belonged to a different system altogether. No one objected. No one questioned the omission. The conversation flowed smoothly around it. Afterward, I asked a colleague whether he had noticed the same thing. He paused before answering, weighing his words carefully. He said that some matters were now being evaluated on a different basis, one that did not always align with historical reference. When I asked what that basis was, he smiled faintly and said he was not sure it had been articulated. That response stayed with me. Around the same time, I became aware of subtle changes in how archival material was handled. Requests for older records were processed more slowly. In some cases, they were fulfilled only partially, with attachments missing or sections redacted without explanation. The redactions did not correspond to any classification markings I recognized. They appeared to have been applied selectively, removing connective tissue rather than substantive content. The effect was disorienting. Documents could still be read, but their internal logic had been interrupted. Conclusions remained, but the steps leading to them were obscured. It was possible to know what had been decided without understanding how or why. I did not challenge these omissions. Doing so would have required identifying an authority to appeal to, and none was apparent. The help desk confirmed that access requests were being handled within authorized parameters. Oversight offices deferred to process. Process deferred to criteria that were not documented. What emerged in place of precedent was a reliance on immediacy. Decisions were justified by current conditions, framed as responses to present realities rather than continuations of established lines. This made them difficult to contest. To question a decision would have required questioning the conditions themselves, and those conditions were rarely defined in concrete terms. Meetings reflected this change. Discussions became narrower in scope, focused on immediate inputs and outputs. Longer-term implications were acknowledged and then set aside. When someone attempted to draw a connection to earlier work, the reference was noted and the conversation moved on. There was no hostility in this, only momentum. I began to understand that the system was no longer designed to remember in the way it once had. Memory, when it existed, was compartmentalized. It could be accessed, but it could not easily be applied. Each decision existed in isolation, justified on its own terms, detached from those that came before. This isolation created a kind of quiet efficiency. Without the burden of precedent, processes moved faster, reviews concluded more quickly. Disagreements were easier to resolve because there was less to argue over. The cost of this efficiency was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. As I watched this new mode of operation settle into place, I realized that it had not required enforcement. No rules had been announced. No penalties had been threatened. The change had been achieved through adjustment rather than instruction. Those within the system learned how to function under the new conditions, because doing so made their work smoother, less resistant. By then, the briefing itself had faded into abstraction. I could no longer recall specific phrases or sequences from it. What remained was its effect, a reorientation of how decisions related to one another, a loosening of the ties that bound present action to past reasoning. The institution continued to function. From the outside, nothing appeared amiss. Inside, however, the way meaning accumulated had changed. Not dramatically. Just enough to ensure that what had been decided before would no longer exert the same pull on what came next. And once that shift had taken hold, it did not reverse. As the months passed, the recalibration began to express itself in ways that were less abstract and more personal. It did not announce itself through reassignment orders or formal notices. Instead, it appeared in the margins of routine interaction, in the subtle reweighting of trust and access that governed daily work. I noticed it first in the questions I was no longer asked. Earlier in my career, colleagues would often seek informal input before advancing a document or framing an issue for review. These exchanges were not mandated by procedure, but they were common, part of an unspoken network of expertise that helped smooth the movement of information. Gradually, those requests tapered off. Documents arrived later in the process, closer to completion, leaving little room for substantive influence. When my input was solicited, it was narrower in scope, confined to technical clarification rather than judgment. At first, I assumed this reflected shifting priorities or workload redistribution. That explanation was comfortable and did not require further scrutiny. But the pattern persisted even as responsibilities elsewhere remained unchanged. It was not that my role had been reduced. It had been reframed. Access followed a similar trajectory. Certain materials that had once been available by default now required explicit justification. The requests were not denied outright. They were delayed or returned with partial fulfillment, or accompanied by reminders about scope and relevance. Each instance was defensible on its own. Taken together, they formed a gentle but unmistakable boundary. What made this boundary difficult to confront was its neutrality. There was no tone of correction, no hint of disapproval. The system did not push back. It simply slowed. And in an environment where speed often determined influence, that slowing had consequence. I became more deliberate in how I engaged. I limited my inquiries, focused my contributions, and avoided drawing attention to areas where the rationale for decisions was opaque. This was not a conscious retreat. It was an adaptation. The system rewarded efficiency and alignment, and I adjusted accordingly. I noticed similar adjustments in others. Conversations became more transactional. Exchanges that once wandered into speculation or broader implication now stayed tightly anchored to immediate objectives. When uncertainty arose, it was acknowledged briefly and then bypassed. The expectation was not that uncertainty be resolved, but that it be contained. There were moments when this containment slipped, usually in private settings. A colleague might pause mid-sentence, reconsider, and then choose not to finish a thought. Another might reference an issue obliquely, testing the space between words before retreating into safer language. These moments were fleeting, but they revealed an underlying awareness that some lines of inquiry no longer led anywhere useful. The system did not prohibit curiosity. It rendered it inefficient. One afternoon, I attended a review session that illustrated this shift with unusual clarity. The agenda was routine, the participants familiar. An issue arose that clearly intersected with earlier work that several of us in the room had been involved in. I referenced that history cautiously, framing it as context rather than argument. The acknowledgement was immediate and polite. Then the discussion moved forward, as if the reference had been a courtesy rather than a contribution. No one challenged me. No one disagreed. The past had simply been acknowledged and set aside. After the meeting, I reflected on how natural this felt in the moment. There had been no sense of rupture, no discomfort. The process had flowed smoothly, efficiently. Only afterward did the absence register. Around this time, I began to notice that records themselves were changing in tone. Summaries grew shorter. Rationales became more generalized. Where documents once traced decisions through a series of considerations, they now emphasized outcomes and compliance. The narrative arc flattened. The why mattered less than the that. This shift had practical benefits. Reviews moved faster. Disputes resolved more easily. Accountability, at least on paper, became simpler to demonstrate. But the cost was a gradual erosion of connective tissue, the kind that allowed understanding to persist beyond the immediate moment. I did not resist this evolution. Resistance would have required a clear alternative, and none presented itself. The new mode of operation worked. It produced results. It aligned with the implicit expectations that now governed movement within the system. What unsettled me was how quickly this new equilibrium had become normal. The briefing that preceded it receded further into the background, no longer a reference point even in my own thinking. Its influence was embedded, no longer traceable to a single moment or instruction. At times, I tried to recall specific details from that morning. Faces, phrases, sequences. They did not come easily. The memory had been overwritten by routine, absorbed into habit. What remained was a sense of constraint that did not feel imposed, but chosen. The system had taught us how to function within narrower bounds by making those bounds comfortable. It did not need to enforce compliance. It only needed to reward adaptation. By the end of that period, I understood that the most significant change had not been procedural or structural. It had been perceptual. The range of what seemed worth pursuing had narrowed, not because it was forbidden, but because it no longer appeared productive. And once that perception took hold, it sustained itself without further intervention. At some point, I became aware that the recalibration was no longer confined to how decisions were processed. It had begun to shape how people spoke about responsibility itself, not in explicit terms, and not through any formal guidance, but through a subtle shift in attribution. Decisions were still attributed, but the attribution no longer carried the same weight it once had. In earlier years, responsibility had a direction. Actions flowed upward for approval and downward for execution. When something went wrong, the path back to its origin could usually be traced, even if doing so required persistence. Now that path had become diffuse. Responsibility appeared as a property of the outcome rather than of the process that produced it. A decision was justified because it existed, not because it could be linked to a clear sequence of authorization. This became apparent during a routine exchange about a delayed initiative. The delay itself was unremarkable. What stood out was the explanation. Instead of identifying a bottleneck or a pending approval, the response framed the delay as an emergent condition, the result of multiple factors aligning in an unfavorable way. No single factor was named. No corrective action was proposed. The explanation satisfied the requirement to explain without revealing anything that could be acted upon. I began to hear this language more often. Outcomes were described as products of alignment or misalignment, conditions rather than decisions. When pressed for clarification, the response was not evasive, but abstract. The effect was disarming. It was difficult to challenge an explanation that did not present a concrete claim. This abstraction extended to accountability mechanisms as well. Reviews still occurred. Metrics were still collected, but the metrics themselves shifted, emphasizing compliance with process over examination of rationale. It became more important to demonstrate that the correct steps had been followed than to articulate why those steps had been taken in the first place. In practice, this meant that responsibility was increasingly distributed across the system rather than concentrated in identifiable roles. Everyone was responsible, which meant no one was singularly accountable. This was not presented as a policy choice. It emerged organically, reinforced by the way information was framed and circulated. I noticed that when issues arose, the instinctive response was to contextualize rather than correct. A deviation would be noted, acknowledged, and absorbed into the broader narrative of system behavior. Corrective action, when it occurred, was incremental and quiet. There were no decisive interventions, no clear signals that something had crossed a line. This had a calming effect. The absence of sharp boundaries reduced friction. It also reduced clarity. Over time, I found myself adjusting my own language to match this pattern. When asked to explain a recommendation, I emphasized alignment and consistency rather than judgment. When describing risks, I framed them as variables rather than probabilities. This was not a conscious strategy. It was simply the language that elicited the least resistance. I became aware of this adjustment one afternoon while reviewing a draft summary I had written earlier in my career. The contrast was striking. The older document named assumptions, weighed alternatives, and arrived at a conclusion through visible reasoning. The current drafts I was producing did none of those things. They presented outcomes as if they had emerged naturally, without contest. Neither approach was inherently wrong. But the difference revealed how much the environment had changed. Conversations reflected this shift as well. Discussions that once involved negotiation over interpretation now focused on managing expectations. The goal was no longer to persuade, but to align. Disagreement was rare, not because consensus had been achieved, but because the space for disagreement had narrowed. What surprised me was how little discomfort this caused. The system had not imposed silence. It had reframed engagement. Participation was still expected, but only within certain bounds. Those bounds were not articulated, but they were widely understood. I occasionally wondered whether this diffusion of responsibility had been intentional. It would have been an effective way to reduce risk, to ensure that no single point of failure could be identified or exploited, but intent was impossible to establish. The pattern existed regardless of its origin. As this mode of operation settled in, the briefing that had preceded it felt increasingly distant. I could no longer connect specific changes to specific statements from that morning. The linkage had dissolved. What remained was a persistent condition, one that shaped behavior without ever being named. The system had become resilient in a new way. It absorbed uncertainty rather than confronting it. It maintained stability by avoiding sharp decisions that could later be questioned. In doing so, it reduced the visibility of agency itself. This reduction did not halt progress. Work continued. Initiatives moved forward. Outcomes were delivered. From the outside, there was little to suggest anything had changed. Internally, however, the meaning of responsibility had shifted from something that could be located and examined to something that was simply assumed. By then, I understood that whatever had been introduced had achieved its purpose not by directing action, but by reshaping the environment in which action occurred. The system no longer required explicit control. It governed itself through the incentives it quietly established, and in that environment, responsibility became less a matter of ownership and more a matter of accommodation. Eventually, the recalibration reached a point where it began to influence not just how decisions were made, but how risk itself was perceived. This shift was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, and it did not announce itself through changes in policy language or formal guidance. Instead, it emerged through the quiet redefinition of what constituted acceptable uncertainty. In earlier periods, risk had been something to be identified, assessed, and mitigated through deliberate action. It was discussed openly, quantified where possible, and balanced against potential outcomes. Disagreement over risk was common, and those disagreements were often productive. They clarified assumptions and forced choices into the open. Now risk seemed to occupy a different category. It was no longer something to be confronted directly. It was something to be managed implicitly. I noticed this most clearly in how proposals were framed. Language that once emphasized trade-offs and contingencies gave way to phrasing that suggested inevitability. Outcomes were described as likely or expected, not because they had been rigorously evaluated, but because they aligned with prevailing conditions. Risk did not disappear from these documents. It was simply absorbed into broader statements about context and alignment. This absorption made risk harder to isolate. When everything was contextual, nothing stood out sharply enough to demand intervention. Questions that might once have prompted a deeper examination were answered with references to systemic considerations, rather than specific vulnerabilities. The effect was not dismissive. It was smoothing. Sharp edges were rounded off before they could catch. In meetings, this shift manifested as a reluctance to dwell on worst-case scenarios. Such scenarios were acknowledged, sometimes even listed, but they were rarely explored in detail. The focus remained on maintaining momentum and coherence. To linger too long on uncertainty was seen as counterproductive, a potential source of delay rather than insight. I found myself adapting to this mode of thinking almost without realizing it. When reviewing materials, I paid less attention to what could go wrong and more to how well a proposal fit within the existing narrative. Proposals that aligned cleanly moved forward with minimal friction. Those that introduced complexity or ambiguity stalled, not because they were rejected, but because they resisted easy integration. This created an environment where risk was not eliminated, but redistributed. Instead of being addressed explicitly at specific points, it was diffused across the system. No single decision carried enough weight to be considered dangerous on its own. The cumulative effect of many small decisions, each defensible in isolation, became the primary source of exposure. I became aware of this dynamic during a review that involved multiple incremental adjustments to an ongoing initiative. Each adjustment was minor, well within acceptable bounds. None raised immediate concern. Taken together, however, they shifted the initiative significantly from its original scope. When this was pointed out, the response was measured and calm. The changes, I was told, reflected evolving conditions. The original scope was no longer the appropriate reference point. That explanation was sufficient. There was no mechanism to revisit the earlier assumptions because those assumptions no longer anchored anything. The initiative had become what it was through a series of small, reasonable steps, none of which could be easily undone without calling the entire process into question. As this pattern repeated, I began to see how effectively it insulated the system from critique. Critique requires contrast. It depends on clear boundaries and defined alternatives. In their absence, there was little to push against. Everything existed within a continuum of adjustment, always responsive, never fixed. This responsiveness was often praised. It was described as agility, as resilience, as an ability to adapt to complexity, and in many ways it was those things. The system did not break under pressure. It flexed. It absorbed shocks by distributing their impact across time and process. What it did not do was pause. There were moments when I wondered whether this perpetual adjustment masked a deeper avoidance. To stop and examine risk explicitly would have required naming it, assigning it weight, and potentially accepting responsibility for its consequences. In an environment where responsibility had already become diffuse, such naming carried little incentive. I noticed that discussions about accountability increasingly focused on compliance rather than judgment. As long as procedures were followed and documentation was complete, outcomes were accepted. The quality of the underlying decisions mattered less than the fact that they had passed through the correct channels. This emphasis reinforced the existing dynamic. Risk became something that existed outside the formal frame, acknowledged but not owned. It was everyone's concern in theory and no one's in practice. By this stage, the recalibration had become self-sustaining. New participants entering the system encountered these norms as givens. They learned quickly how to frame issues, how to avoid friction, how to align their work with prevailing expectations. There was no need to instruct them. The environment itself did the teaching. Looking back, I realized that the briefing had not introduced new information so much as it had legitimized a different way of processing information. It had signaled, without stating outright, that the traditional relationship between risk, responsibility, and decision-making was no longer the only acceptable model. The system had not abandoned caution. It had redefined it. Caution now meant avoiding disruption rather than confronting danger. Stability was preserved not by addressing risk head-on, but by ensuring that no single point of decision ever bore enough weight to threaten the whole. This approach worked. It kept things moving. It reduced visible conflict. It maintained an appearance of control. But it also ensured that when risk finally did surface in a tangible way, it would do so without a clear origin, without a clear owner, and without an obvious path for redress. By then, this outcome no longer felt hypothetical. It felt like a structural inevitability, built quietly into the way the system now understood itself. What changed next was not the scale of activity, but the way outcomes were acknowledged. Decisions still produced effects, sometimes visible, sometimes subtle, but the recognition of those effects became increasingly abstract. Success and failure were no longer discussed as endpoints. They were treated as transient states, absorbed quickly into the ongoing flow of adjustment. I noticed this during a sequence of reviews that followed a set of initiatives nearing completion. Under previous norms, completion triggered evaluation. Metrics were examined, assumptions revisited, and lessons recorded for future use. Now, completion was marked administratively and then set aside. The documentation emphasized adherence to process and timeliness, with little attention paid to whether the original objectives had been met in any meaningful sense. When outcomes were mentioned, they were framed as indicators rather than conclusions. A result suggested alignment or misalignment, nothing more. The implication was that outcomes did not close a loop. They simply informed the next adjustment. This framing reduced the pressure to account for consequences. If nothing truly ended, nothing could truly fail. I found this approach initially disorienting. It challenged habits I had developed over years of work, habits rooted in the belief that decisions should be evaluated against their intended effects. Over time, however, I began to see how neatly this new model fit with the broader recalibration. By dissolving endpoints, it removed the need for reckoning. This was not a matter of evasion. No one appeared to be avoiding responsibility consciously. Rather, the structure itself made responsibility less relevant. Outcomes flowed into subsequent actions without pause, transformed into inputs rather than judgments. The system moved continuously, never stopping long enough to invite scrutiny. I became aware of how this affected my own expectations. When a project concluded, I no longer anticipated a thorough review. I assumed the documentation would be minimal and the discussion brief. When that proved true, it felt normal. The absence of evaluation no longer registered as a gap. It was simply how things were done. This normalization extended beyond formal processes. Informal conversations reflected the same pattern. When someone mentioned a completed effort, the focus quickly shifted to what came next. Questions about effectiveness or unintended consequences were acknowledged politely and then set aside. The collective attention remained fixed on forward motion. At times, I wondered whether this constant orientation toward the future masked a reluctance to confront the past. To examine outcomes closely would have required revisiting the decisions that produced them, decisions that now existed within a diffuse web of attribution. Such examination risked unsettling the equilibrium that had taken hold. The system seemed to prefer continuity over clarity. I saw this preference reinforced in the way issues were escalated. Escalation no longer implied urgency or concern. It was treated as a routing mechanism, a way of repositioning information rather than highlighting its significance. When an issue moved upward, it did not gather weight, it dispersed. This dispersion was evident in the language used at higher levels. Briefings became shorter, summaries more generalized. Specifics were subsumed into broader narratives about trends and conditions. The higher the level of review, the less concrete the discussion became. By the time information reached its highest point of visibility, it had been stripped of anything that might provoke a decisive response. I began to understand that decisiveness itself had become a liability. Clear decisions created fixed points that could later be questioned. Ambiguous outcomes, by contrast, blended seamlessly into the ongoing stream of activity. They left no sharp edges. This realization altered how I approached my own work. I focused on ensuring that my contributions aligned with prevailing narratives rather than pushing for definitive conclusions. When ambiguity arose, I allowed it to remain. The system did not reward resolution. It rewarded compatibility. There were moments when this approach felt efficient, even elegant. Complexity was managed through absorption rather than confrontation. Conflicting signals were smoothed out over time. The institution appeared resilient, capable of maintaining stability amid uncertainty. Yet I could not ignore the cost. Without clear endpoints, learning became difficult. Without learning, adaptation risked becoming repetition. The system adjusted continuously, but it did not necessarily improve. It simply changed. I observed this stagnation most clearly when similar issues resurfaced in slightly altered forms. The context would differ, the language would shift, but the underlying dynamics remained the same. Each time, the response followed the established pattern: acknowledgement, adjustment, movement on. No cumulative understanding emerged. At some point, I realized that the recalibration had effectively insulated the system from reflection. Reflection required stillness, and stillness had become incompatible with the way work now proceeded. Everything was provisional. Everything was subject to revision. Nothing settled long enough to be examined. The briefing that initiated this condition felt increasingly distant, not because its influence had waned, but because it had been fully integrated. Its principles were no longer distinct. They had become assumptions. By then, the system no longer needed to signal its boundaries. Those within it had internalized them. Decisions were made with an intuitive sense of what would pass smoothly and what would generate friction. The path of least resistance became the default guide. This internalization marked a turning point. The recalibration was complete, not when the system changed, but when those operating within it stopped noticing that it had. And once that awareness faded, the new equilibrium became indistinguishable from normalcy. It was only after the new equilibrium had settled that I began to sense its limits. Not because anything broke, but because certain responses became predictable in a way they had not been before. The system adapted smoothly to variation within a defined range, but when signals emerged that did not fit that range, the response was not adjustment, it was deferral. These signals were not dramatic. They did not arrive as crises or failures. They appeared as anomalies that resisted easy categorization, a review that could not be closed because its premises no longer aligned with current framing, an initiative that continued to receive resources despite producing outcomes that could not be clearly articulated, a decision that remained technically valid while becoming increasingly detached from its stated purpose. In earlier periods, such anomalies would have prompted a pause. Someone would have asked whether the underlying assumptions still held. That question no longer surfaced. Instead, the anomalies were routed sideways, placed into holding patterns that allowed activity to continue without resolution. They were neither corrected nor confronted. They were managed through postponement. I noticed this first in how issues were tracked. Status indicators multiplied, creating space between acknowledgement and action. Items were marked under review, pending alignment, awaiting further context. These labels did not imply neglect. They signaled patience. The assumption was that clarity would emerge on its own if given enough time. This patience was not passive. Work continued around the unresolved points. Adjacent processes moved forward. New initiatives were launched that intersected with the unresolved ones, layering complexity without addressing the core uncertainty. Over time, the original anomaly became less visible, obscured by the accumulation of related activity. When I attempted to trace one such issue back to its origin, I found that the path no longer existed in a coherent form. References pointed to revisions. Revisions pointed to updates. Updates pointed to contextual shifts. Each link was valid, but the chain did not lead back to a single decision. The issue had become distributed across time and documentation. This distribution made responsibility difficult to assign, but it also made correction unlikely. To intervene would have required unraveling a web of incremental choices, each defensible on its own. There was no clear moment at which a different decision could have been made without calling the entire sequence into question. I realized then that deferral had become the system's preferred response to ambiguity, not because ambiguity was feared, but because resolving it would have required introducing fixed points. Fixed points invited scrutiny. Scrutiny invited accountability. Deferral avoided all three. This approach had consequences. Unresolved issues accumulated quietly, not as problems, but as background conditions. They shaped subsequent decisions without ever being examined directly. Over time, they narrowed the range of available options, constraining future action in ways that were difficult to perceive. I felt this constraint most acutely when considering alternatives. Proposals that diverged meaningfully from existing trajectories encountered subtle resistance, not rejection, but friction. Questions multiplied. Requirements expanded. Timelines stretched. The proposals did not fail. They stalled. Eventually, they were reframed to fit within existing contours, losing whatever distinctiveness they had originally possessed. In contrast, proposals that aligned with established patterns moved easily, even when their benefits were modest. Alignment had become the primary criterion for viability. Innovation was tolerated only insofar as it did not disrupt the prevailing flow. This was not the result of a stated preference. It emerged from the cumulative effect of deferral and diffusion. When unresolved issues lingered, they created incentives to avoid further complication. Simplicity became synonymous with compatibility, and compatibility with safety. I found myself internalizing these incentives. When drafting recommendations, I emphasized continuity over divergence. I framed options in ways that minimized deviation, even when alternatives might have offered clearer resolution. This was not self-censorship. It was efficiency. The system responded more readily to proposals that did not demand re-examination of underlying assumptions. The cost of this efficiency was a gradual narrowing of imagination. Possibilities that once seemed viable were no longer considered worth the effort. They were not prohibited. They were simply impractical within the existing environment. I began to wonder how many unresolved issues the system could sustain before their cumulative effect became visible. The structure was resilient, but resilience had its limits. Deferred decisions did not disappear. They waited, influencing outcomes indirectly, shaping constraints without being acknowledged. There were moments when this accumulation surfaced briefly, usually when multiple deferred issues intersected. In those moments, the response was swift and procedural. Additional layers of review were introduced. Temporary measures were put in place. The immediate tension was relieved without addressing its source. Afterward, the system returned to its steady state. By then, it was clear to me that the recalibration had not eliminated uncertainty. It had relocated it. Uncertainty no longer resided in discrete decisions where it could be examined. It existed in the gaps between decisions, in the spaces created by deferral. Those spaces were difficult to see from within. They were not documented. They were not discussed. Yet they exerted influence all the same, shaping what could be said, what could be proposed, and what could be resolved. As this understanding took hold, I realized that the most consequential outcome of the briefing was not any specific change it produced, but the method it legitimized. A way of operating that favored continuity over clarity, alignment over resolution, and deferral over decision. The system had learned how to move without deciding, how to adapt without committing, and how to maintain stability without confronting its own assumptions. It functioned smoothly. It remained coherent. But beneath that coherence was a growing accumulation of unresolved questions. held in place by a structure that no longer provided a mechanism for addressing them. That accumulation did not feel urgent. It did not demand attention. It simply existed, shaping the boundaries of what could happen next. And by then, it was clear that whatever reckoning might eventually come would not announce itself as a single moment or event. It would emerge gradually from the convergence of many small deferrals that had long since faded from view. I did not recognize the moment when the process reached its conclusion, because there was no clear signal that anything had ended. What I recognized instead was a shift in my own expectations. At some point, I stopped anticipating resolution altogether. The question was no longer how an issue would be decided, but how long it would remain in circulation before being absorbed into the background. This realization did not arrive suddenly. It emerged gradually, through repetition. Each time an unresolved matter resurfaced without prompting action, it reinforced the understanding that persistence alone was not a catalyst for change. The system was capable of sustaining indefinite motion without arriving at closure, and it appeared comfortable doing so. I became aware of this most clearly when an issue I had flagged months earlier reappeared in a different form. The language had been revised. The framing had shifted. The surrounding context had changed. Yet the underlying concern was unmistakably the same. It had not been addressed. It had been reintroduced, reshaped to fit the current moment, stripped of its earlier implications. No one acknowledged the continuity. There was no reference to its prior appearance. The issue was treated as new, evaluated on its immediate characteristics, and routed accordingly. In that moment, I understood that memory, in the institutional sense, was no longer cumulative. It was episodic. Each occurrence stood alone, detached from its predecessors. This episodic structure made closure unnecessary. If each instance was self-contained, there was no obligation to resolve it in relation to what came before. Decisions could be made, revisited, or deferred without ever forming a narrative arc. The system did not forget. It compartmentalized. I reflected on how thoroughly this approach insulated the institution from reckoning. Without continuity, there could be no accumulation of consequence. Without accumulation, there could be no decisive moment that demanded recognition. Everything unfolded in fragments, each manageable, each defensible. From the outside, this fragmentation appeared as stability. Programs continued. Policies evolved. Outcomes were delivered. There was no visible breakdown. Inside, however, something essential had been redistributed. Responsibility, memory, and risk had all been dispersed across time and process, diluted until none of them exerted enough force to compel change. I thought back to the briefing that had initiated this condition. I could no longer recall specific statements from it, only the structure it had implied. A way of conveying information without anchoring it. A way of establishing boundaries without naming them. A way of altering behavior without issuing instruction. That structure had proven remarkably effective. It required no enforcement. It generated no resistance. It aligned incentives quietly, guiding adaptation through ease rather than constraint. Those who operated within it learned how to function smoothly, how to avoid friction, how to remain relevant without challenging the prevailing flow. In this environment, dissent did not need to be suppressed. It simply lost momentum. Questions that could not be answered easily were allowed to persist without consequence. Over time, they ceased to be asked. I recognized that I had adapted fully when I found myself counseling a newer colleague to frame an issue differently. I did not discourage him from raising it. I suggested, instead, that he emphasize alignment, minimize deviation, and avoid drawing attention to unresolved aspects that might complicate review. He nodded, grateful for the guidance. I had not silenced him. I had taught him how to be heard. That exchange unsettled me more than any procedural change had. It revealed how completely the recalibration had been internalized, not just by the system, but by those within it. The condition no longer needed to be maintained. It perpetuated itself through practice. I do not know whether the outcome that was being avoided ever materialized. If it did, it would have emerged gradually, diffused across decisions that no longer pointed back to a single origin. If it did not, the system would have continued as it was, efficient, adaptable, and insulated from introspection. What I do know is that the briefing achieved something rare. It altered not what we knew, but how we knew. It changed the relationship between information and consequence, between decision and memory. It introduced a mode of operation that rendered conclusions optional. There was no final directive, no closing document, no acknowledgement that anything fundamental had shifted. The process simply continued, carrying its own logic forward, indifferent to whether it was understood. And in that indifference lay its durability. By the time I recognized this, there was nothing left to document. The condition had become ambient, indistinguishable from the environment in which we worked. It did not demand belief. It did not require consent. It functioned because it no longer needed either. The briefing, which had left no record, had succeeded in leaving something far more enduring behind. Not an answer, a method.